Beef from Pastures, and I'm presenting tonight on how much more profitable are the best beef producers and what do they do differently. The procedure for tonight's webinar follows. I'm going to introduce you to the webinar platform and how to interact with the webinar. For many of you, this might be your first webinar experience. I'm going to then go on to introduce you to the MLA More Beef from Pastures program. I'm going to deliver the presentation, and the webinar will run for approximately 30 minutes, after which we'll open it up for questions. I aim to be on time so that you can get on and do other things, and we've tried to make this as efficient as possible. I'm pretty new to the webinar process, so please provide me with some latitude as I'm a bit of a Luddite. I'm also in a reasonably dodgy Telstra zone, so if reception drops for any reason, I'll try and get back up as quickly as possible. Now, you're all muted throughout the course of the webinar, and the main reason for that is just to stop excess noise. But what you do have the capacity to use is the chat or questions session. So if you can just type in that. If you want to type a question, feel free to use that. It's also useful for interacting with me, so maybe if you can just tell me that you can hear me loud and clear, that'll give me some confidence that I'm not just talking to my screen and that no one can hear me. So I've got a couple of responses. Everyone is now responding that they can hear me loud and clear. That's great. So a lot of you have already used the platform and you're familiar with it. Thanks very much for your responses. So if you've got questions along the way, feel free to put them into that questions tab. I'll try and answer them as we go, but it mightn't be until the end that I do. Look, also on the line, I've got David Brown, who's a consultant with Holmes Sackett. He's assisting me with answering some of the questions as we go. And I also just want to introduce you to the survey concept. At the end of this, there will be a survey. That survey is really important to us to report back to MLA who have funded this through the More Beef from Pastures program, and it's very important for them to get that feedback, A, to make sure that we're delivering return on their investment, and B, to make sure that you've got a mechanism for feedback to provide us with the opportunity to interact about future opportunities. Look, I'll just introduce you quickly to the MLA More Beef from Pastures website. This is a screenshot from that website. I apologise for the background. I'm in the flight path at Wagga, and that's a plane coming in from Sydney at the moment. So, look, this is a screenshot. All it shows is basically, look, the aim of these webinars really to give you the taste of the type of information that's available through the program. Much of that information's available in more detail in follow-up events. So this is really a first hit sort of exposure type events, and the idea is that in those follow-up events you improve your knowledge and skill and ultimately change practice change. That leads on to practice change, which leads on to improvements in productivity and profitability for you guys. So on this screenshot there's 7 modules in the manual, and this is freely available to you, and in each of these modules there's a whole lot of information and tools, and there's a lot of really good stuff in the online manual. Tonight's webinar fits into the setting directions module, which is about assessing current position, establishing your business goals and understanding options for improvement. Alright, so I'm going to hop straight into our presentation. Look, I'll talk a little about what the most profitable do differently, and I guess the background to this presentation is that the information derived or that's provided here comes from the Holmes Sackett Fund Benchmarking Database. Now that database spans across southeastern Australia, from the New England of New South Wales right through to Tasmania and into South Australia and Victoria. Now if you're from zones outside of that area, I just want to say that this information may be less applicable to you because your systems are different, so just understand that you need to put it in context. Now there's a cohort of about 150 producers in that benchmarking data set, and tonight we'll be looking at what the most profitable do. And to be in the most profitable beef producers, what we've done is taken out those people who perform not only at a per DSE level, but also at a per hectare per 100 mils level. So, and they've had to benchmark for a number of years, at least 4 of the last 5 years. So their long-term performance is what we're looking at, because anyone can get lucky in 1 year and be a top 20% producer. It's that consistent performance that we're interested in. So why does it matter? Well, this slide here really demonstrates why it matters. And this title of this slide is what's at stake. Well, there's 120 grand up for grabs, really. The most profitable beef producers generate a whole farm return approximately 6% over the long term, and that's operating return to assets managed. Now, return to assets managed is a measure of whole farm resource efficiency. It's calculated by dividing profit, earnings before interest and tax, by the total value of the asset base, the majority of which will be made up of land, livestock and plant equipment. It's a measure of the efficiency because it shows the returns generated on all the capital invested in the business. In this way, returns can be compared with those of other asset classes, such as residential real estate or equities or any number of other asset classes. Look, the most profitable business producers or beef producers generate returns of approximately 3% higher than the average. So the average do about 3% over the long term, and the top 20% generate about 6%. So for every $1 million worth of asset value under management, they generate $30,000 more in profit. So over the average asset value of $4 million, the most profitable beef producers will generate $120,000 more profit than the average. Now, they will invest more to do it, but at that level, the level of investment, there is a reasonable return on that additional investment made. Someone's just asked if there's meant to be sound. Look, it would be great. I can't respond because they can't hear me, so I'm going to keep going. Look, on to the best achieve better per DSE profit. So what I'm presenting here is a comparison of the components of the financials per DSE. I'll also show a comparison on a per hectare basis to demonstrate that the results differ between per DSE performance and per hectare performance. The graph compares the most profitable cohort of those 9 producers with the average. So the average includes those most profitable, so it's actually skewed upwards with the inclusion of those most profitable. So the data shows that there's only a small difference in income per DSE between those 2 cohorts. And this suggests that prices appear not to have a major impact on the income derived per DSE. This is typical of commodity production. If you're a beef producer, you're a commodity producer, which effectively means you have little influence over the price received. The next financial indicator of this graph shows that there's also only a marginal difference in enterprise expenses per DSE between cohorts. So both cohorts sit at around $6 per DSE. Enterprise expenses are those expenses directly associated with the operation of the enterprise. So they include things like animal health, contract services, freight, selling costs and supplementary feed. If you go through to the next financial indicator on this graph, it's overhead costs. And this is where you start to see a large difference at the per DSE level of $4.60 between those 2 cohorts, with the most profitable having a far lower overhead cost structure. Now, overhead costs are the cost of doing business, and they include things like administration, depreciation, utilities, motor vehicles and wages. A good example of how this works is to talk to the issue of labour efficiency. So the reason that these overhead expenses are lower per DSE, this starts to talk to some of the productivity differences, and that is because basically the most profitable run more productive units for the same overhead cost structure, and therefore they have a lower overhead cost structure per productive unit. So if you think about this in terms of labour efficiency or labour costs, as livestock numbers increase for the same level of labour, it doesn't necessarily follow that you need to have additional labour to manage the additional labours, to manage the additional livestock. So if the existing labour resources can manage the greater numbers of livestock, then there's no net increase in labour costs, and that leads to a decrease in overhead costs per productive unit, in this case the DSE. Now that's the same for many of the overhead costs within that class. I'll talk a bit more to that shortly. At the profit level, it's the combination of all those three components that led to a difference of $6.23 in favour of the most profitable. This is a 70% relative difference in profit per DSE. I've got a question here. Where does interest expense sit in the overheads? Look, that's a good question. Thanks for your question, Sarah. It doesn't. We put financing costs and lease costs below the profit line. So it's earnings before interest and before tax. So we consider those financing costs, because they're a discretionary cost to some extent, and every business is different. We don't want them to skew the results, so we put them below the profit line. Okay. But this slide demonstrates the same thing, but in per hectare per 100 mils of rainfall. So it's showing the comparison of the components of the financials per hectare per 100 mils of rainfall. Now, the reason that we take into consideration the rainfall is that it allows for comparisons of businesses between different localities, even though there's differences in the value of the resources applied. So you can look at a business in a rangelands environment and look at a business at a high rainfall environment and compare the two without the effect of rainfall having an influence on the productivity differences. So the data shows that there's a small that small difference in income seen per DSE becomes a very large difference in income per hectare per 100 mils. And that's also mimicked at the enterprise expense level. Now, the key reason for that is that the most profitable have higher feed utilisation. In order to utilise more feed, they manage greater numbers of livestock and have better systems. And so those greater numbers of livestock per hectare relative to the average are what's driving that difference at the per hectare level when it looked relatively similar at the per DSE level. At the overhead expense level, the expenses which were lower per DSE are marginally higher per hectare, and some of that's due to a greater investment in fertiliser, and some might be associated with additional labour as well. But that's not always the case. So at the profit level per hectare per 100 mils of rain, it's the difference in income that has the major influence on the outcome. The small difference at the enterprise expense level and overhead expense level per hectare, they sort of narrow the margin, but the major difference is $20 per hectare per 100 mils, which is a difference of more than 100%. So I'm just going to talk to why per hectare returns are important, and this graph sort of sums it up to some extent. This graph's generated from the Holmes Sackett farm benchmarking data, and what it shows is that on average land comprises over 80% of the total asset base. Now the other components are livestock, which is 15%, and plant and equipment, which is around 3%. Now this is on average, that varies between farms, I appreciate that. But in the majority of cases, land is the majority of your asset base. So given that land comprises the majority of your asset base, it makes sense to invest to generate the best return on that component of the asset base. Rather than just the heads, you want to be investing in the things that generate you the best return on the land. Okay, so what is the driver of the difference of profit per hectare? this just takes some of the key performance indicators and looks at those, and the orange on this graph is the most profitable and the blue is the average of all. On the left-hand axis we've just got digits running from 0 to 50, and along the bottom we've got production in kilograms of live weight per DSE and production in kilograms of beef per hectare per 100 mils. And so what you're looking at is, when you look at production in kilograms of live weight per DSE, is very little difference there, and that's what drove very little difference at the income level per DSE. When you're looking at production in kilos of beef per hectare per 100 mils, there's a 18 kilos per hectare per 100 mils difference between those most profitable producers and the remainder. That's a difference of greater than 50% in relative terms between those two cohorts. So it's production that's driving the difference at a per hectare level. So when you take that through to pasture utilisation, and we've done this with a bit of extrapolation, what we've found is that the best produce about 36 kilos of beef for every tonne of pasture produced, while the remainder produce about 24 kilos of beef for every tonne of pasture produced. So it's not the fact that that they grow more grass. So it's not, those guys, the most profitable aren't more profitable because they grow more grass. They're not gifted anything that doesn't necessarily occur on a range of other businesses with similar resources. It's just that they're more efficient at turning the same amount of grass into saleable product. And I think that's a great news story for environmental sustainability, because it shows resource efficiency at its best. The question, therefore, for southern beef producers in my mind is, do you want to be a one-state producer or do you want to be a 1.5 state producer? And my guess is the 1.5 state producers aren't stopping there, and they're looking at how they can get to producing 1.75 or 2 states relative to that average cohort. The consequence of high feed utilisation is stocking rate. And what I've done here is compared the stocking rate in DSEs per hectare per 100 mils of the most profitable, which is the orange bars, relative to the average of all, which is the blue bars. And what I've taken is their average annual stocking rate, which is the first two lines, and then I've looked at the midwinter stocking rate. And there's a couple of key points I think that this slide talks to. And the first is that the most profitable run at an average annual stocking rate of 2.4 DSEs per hectare per 100 mils. Now that's a simple measure that you can look at within your own business to see where you sit relative to the average, which is less than 2, and relative to the most profitable, which is 2.4. And the second thing is that their midwinter stocking rate is about between 20 and 30% lower than their average annual stocking rate. So they do that by having good systems. But in any case, I guess one of the other key things that this graph demonstrates is that the most profitable are approximately have stocking rates that are approximately 40% higher than the average to achieve those levels of feed utilisation that provide that level of beef production per tonne of feed of 36 kilos. So all of that looks relatively easy on paper. However, there's a few major considerations if you're going to choose the path of optimum stocking rates. And I think the first of those is the need to act quickly and be decisive. Sorry, there's a question here. Murray Phoenix asked a question, so calving at the right time. Yeah, I'm getting there, Murray. Calving at the right time is absolutely critical to achieving those stocking rates. And that right time is what's driving the disparity between the average annual stocking rate and the midwinter stocking rate. So really what I mean is calving midwinter is not an option because there won't be that disparity between average annual stocking rate and midwinter stocking rate. But great question. So just getting on to one of the points that I wanted to make, if you're choosing that path of increasing stocking rate or improving feed utilisation, the first is you really need to act quickly and be decisive. Tactical management at optimum stocking rates is extremely time sensitive. And so where you had time to I guess dawdle or hope for the next rain at suboptimal stocking rates, you have no time for those sorts of types of indecision, and you have to be decisive. So because everything becomes more time sensitive, and I believe the fact that these producers are constantly making difficult decisions is actually one of the reasons that they have smaller losses in major droughts relative to the average. Now the next point I want to make is that it's also difficult to manage animal health once you get up to these optimum stocking rates. Well, it's not difficult, it just means that you're going to have to manage animal health issues in a proactive way rather than a reactive way. Because as livestock numbers increase, or as you increase feed utilisation, there's less ability to call on livestock condition to withstand those animal health issues, and that means that previously minor concerns can result in major production losses when livestock numbers per hectare are increased or when you're running closer to optimum. So they're two things that I think you really need to be on top of if you're going to move down this path of suboptimum to optimum. And there's a range of tools that assist you in doing so. Look, I just thought that I'd throw this one in. It doesn't really add a lot of value to what I've previously talked of, but it just shows the cost of production and the fact that that is a key driver of the difference in per hectare profits. It's not price driven. So what this slide shows is on the left-hand axis is dollars per kilo live weight running from $0 to $2. And then you've got that same cohort in orange of the more profitable relative to the average, and you've got two financial indicators down the bottom, cost of production on the left and price received on the right. And that you can see there's very little difference in price received between those two cohorts. So it's not price that drives that difference, it's cost of production. And cost of production is a combination of the impact of production and costs in generating that production. So beef margins, like mining and other commodity industries, are driven by maintaining a low cost of production. And I'm going to talk now to some of the things that drive that low cost of production. And as Murray already alluded to, calving time is one of those. And I think systems is one of the others. So how do you do it? Look, I think the first thing is that the more profitable producers really understand the importance of this, and they understand it because it underpins their strategy. So this is a pasture growth curve. It's from southern New South Wales. Now your pasture growth curves will be specific to your area and the species grown. I know that the New England doesn't look like this. It looks better than this. And there's other areas where it doesn't look peak as highly in spring, but the trough in winter might be greater, and the peak in autumn might be higher and might occur at different times. But really, what this is about is setting the strategy of your business. So what this tells me about this part of the world is firstly that around 40 to 50% of the total feed for the year is occurring in those spring months. So the first thing that flags to me is I've got to have a system where the majority of my production is set up to capture that. The second is that winter is a period of very low feed supply. And the third thing, I guess, is that autumn it kicks up, but summer I can expect to have very little feed in this part of the world. Now, as I say, that might be different for your part of the world. Understand that feed supply curve because it should dictate your feed demand, and your feed demand is how your strategy is set. So So none of the most profitable beef producers have a calving date that occurs in midwinter. Of those 9 producers, not one of them have a midwinter calving date. Most of the most profitable producers also have a time of turn-off that coincides with the period when feed quality declines. So even though this is a feed supply or feed pasture growth curve, it does tell me it's an indicator for pasture quality. And what I see from this is that as pasture growth declines, typically pasture quality declines. So in this part of the world, my view is that you'd want to have your trading livestock off by December because feed quality is likely to be declining by that point, and you want to have your calving date somewhere after midwinter, preferably as that line is starting to kick up. Okay, so why is calving date and sensible systems important? Well, I think this slide says it all. The title of this slide is that sensible systems equate to efficient resource use, and really what this comes down to is driving a low cost of production through improvements in productivity. The vertical axis is actually a stocking rate index. It's indexed to the midwinter stocking rate. Now both of these herds have the same midwinter stocking rate, and then the curve looks at the feed demand profile of 2 different systems. The first, the blue line, is a spring calving system turning off feeders in December. The orange line is an autumn calving system turning off weaners, I think in around March from memory. The stocking rate is an index because I didn't want to complicate it by putting actual DSEs on this curve. So the vertical axis is a stocking rate and it's indexed to the midwinter stocking rate. Okay, so 1 is the midwinter stocking rate, which is equivalent for both, and the midwinter I'm calling is the average of June, July, August in this case. Now the key message of this slide is that really only one of these systems delivers a feed demand curve that matches the feed supply curve shown in the previous graph. And it's the matching of that feed demand curve with feed supply that delivers those high levels of pasture utilisation, and it's those high levels of pasture utilisation that lead to more per hectare production and greater per header and greater relative per hectare production than some of those alternatives like the orange line. Now there could be any number of systems that deliver the same outcome specific to your location, but you need to conduct the exercise to establish whether that's the case or not. So I strongly recommend getting some of the tools and just working out what is your stocking rate by a month, because that will indicate how you sit in terms of feed, matching that feed demand curve to feed supply. Look, I just thought I'd throw this one in. It's one of my pets and it's why calving date matters. What we've got on the left-hand axis, and this goes back to answering Murray's question, is midwinter feed consumption in kilograms of dry matter per head per day, and that per head is cow or cow-calf unit. And along the bottom axis, what we've got is the calving month. So we're looking at just a comparison of July, August and September in here. And the key message from this slide really is that an August calving month utilises 10% less feed than a July calving month. What's the implication of that? Well, the implication of that is that you can run 10% more cows, August calving cows, relative to July calving cows through midwinter. And if you take that out to September, and I know that a lot of you are cringing at the moment and thinking about calf scours and all the other concerns, but if you take that out to September and compare your September calving relative to a July calving, you'll actually run 15% more cows relative to a July calving. Why? Because they calve later, so their nutritional demands per head are lower through those midwinter months. So that's why calving date matters. No one's on suppliers. I didn't see a mass exodus on that slide. So how do you deal with these is the title of this slide. Look, I think there's more to it than just the technical components of the most profitable. And I've added this slide to show that one of the key different features or attributes really of the most profitable isn't measured in the benchmarking, and that's attitude. I'm yet to find one of the more profitable producers who can't look past the hurdles to achieve the key objective, which is more profit per hectare. What they tend to do is think creatively about solutions, and they don't stop at one option when they're making decisions. So they never just look for, they find a solution, but they're always looking for a better solution. My experience is that is a key differentiating feature, and there's a number of people that I've been exposed to over the last little while in consultancy, and there's those that make it happen and there's those that procrastinate, and the ones that make it happen are the ones that tend to have higher levels of profitability, and they also act in a more diligent way. Okay, so what are the key targets for $120,000 more profit? And I put these up to give you just that, a target. It could be that there's any number of constraints that mean that you may never achieve these because your resources don't allow you to. So I'm talking on conceptually here or theoretically. It could be that you need to, well, it's not could be, you need to consider your own resource base to understand whether some of these are achievable. But the first one is 36 kilos of beef per tonne of pasture produced. Now, in order to achieve that, you obviously need to know how many tonnes of pasture produced per annum. And you also need to know how many kilos of beef do you produce from every hectare. So I think that's a really key message there, is understand your own systems, know what the metrics are in your business. 20 kilos of beef per DSE. Now that should be achievable. If you're not achieving that, it could be, it's more than likely an indicator of your system than anything else. 45 kilos of beef per hectare for 100 mils of rainfall. That is on the high end, but it is achievable. And finally, sensible systems. And really, when I'm talking sensible systems, what I'm talking about is calving date right, which is the time when feed supply increases, and finishing livestock off by the period when feed quality declines. So what are the key messages? Look, I think there's a few. The first is, in order to do make some of these changes, you really need to measure and understand your own per hectare and per DSE performance and production. So there's any number of tools that you can use to assist you in that. The cost of production tool is a great first step. The next is that if you want to prioritise something within your business, the first thing you should be prioritising is pasture utilisation. If you don't know how to do that at the moment, there's some great tools within that manual, and I'm more than willing to listen to you in terms of feedback on the survey, which I'll go to shortly. Finally, is that low cost structures are absolutely critical, as is being on top of your animal health as you move towards those optimum levels of productivity. And finally is that making decisions and having a feed budget is a really important part, a component to giving you that pathway to getting there. You won't do it without understanding some of the metrics and being on top of some of those really important parts of measuring your business. So I'm going to open it up now to questions. I'm a little bit over time, but before I do open it up to questions, look, you're welcome to leave the webinar now. I just want to reiterate how important that survey is. Once you close the webinar, the survey will actually open up, but it's really important to us to make sure that we're generating a return on investment for MLA. So it takes literally a minute or two. It's not that taxing. So I would appreciate if you do leave now, if you can just and even if you leave later on, can you please fill out that survey? It's really important to us. So I'll open it up now to questions, and I'm and criticisms and start. Thankfully, I'm not in the room, so I can't be exposed to all the things you're throwing at me at the moment. So, Hugh Webb's asked, any hormones used? Thanks for the question. Look, there are HGPs in some of those top producers, but not all. In fact, some come from Tasmania, where it's not possible to use them, I believe. But so look, I think that raises another important issue, is that just like the average of the database, within that top 20%, there is a huge range or variation within that top 20%, and they didn't all get to the end game, which is more profit, in exactly the same way. There was a number of pathways for getting there. Some chose a high productivity pathway, which had slightly higher costs, and some chose a really low, a lower productivity pathway, but had very good cost structures. The next question is, how do you factor in the feed consumed by older calves still on the cow? Okay, Sue, there's a bit of, I think I'm going to have to read into a little bit of what you're asking here, and I think what you may be asking refers to the slide of that midwinter feed consumption. The way I did that was to use a tool called GrazFeed, and GrazFeed is a modelling tool which uses science and trials throughout the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s to establish what the level of livestock intake is at different levels of pasture in both biomass and quality. So I held feed quality constant for that, but if there was a calf at foot, that tool will actually tell me how much the calf is eating and how much the cow is eating. So I use that tool to tell me how much feed is consumed by those older calves. Now, how can you do that yourself, which might be your question? Look, there are a number of tools that will assist you in doing that, but so things like GrazFeed tables, which are in some of those Evergraze, in some of the Evergraze work, or also in the More Beef from Pastures manual, there's a range of tools that may assist you with that. But thanks for the question, it's a very good one. Any other questions or comments? There's a question here, how can you best manage rainfall variability, e.g. spring break failure? And that's from Sarah McIntosh. I'm guessing you're from the New England, given that question. Look, that is a very good question. And I think probably, I don't know whether you were present in the tools webinar, but basically what I think you should do, the first step is a feed budget. So understanding exactly what level of consumption at your current stocking rate you're going to need through the next, say, 6 months. Then I think the next step is establishing what your pasture growth rates are now. And I can, when I look at, well, I'll actually drag it up while I'm talking to you at the risk of really stuffing this up. I'm going to go to a tool that hopefully will assist me in answering this question. So here's Glen Innes at the moment. This is Pasture Growth Outlook. I am getting to responding to your question, Sarah, and I hope I'm doing it in a reasonable way. So this is the Glen Innes Pasture Growth Outlook tool. There's 3 lines on this curve. The top one is the 90th percentile, or best years in terms of pasture growth. What we're looking at is a weekly pasture growth curve, which is the green one, and the bottom 10% of years is the bottom dotted line, and the median is the black dotted line. Now, what that's showing me is already at Glen Innes at the moment, I'm sitting on very low pasture growth rates, and normally I would have pasture growth rates of probably around 40 kilos per hectare per day or thereabouts. Now, the thing that's told me is for the last 4 weeks, I've had, let's call it 10 kilos per hectare per day average, which is, let's say 30 days I've had 30 kilos less than average. So I'm already down 900 kilos per hectare on normal, for want of a better term. That's how I use this tool. Now, even if you got a heap of rain tomorrow, are you likely to spike straight up? Probably not. So that means you might go up in a trajectory that that might be over a few weeks to get me back to normal. So you might have cut yourself out of 1,500 kilos of feed. I guess the key message there is if you've cut yourself out of 1,500 kilos of feed and you're at optimum stocking rates, you're going to have to think about what you can do to make that up. And one way is to supplementary feed, and the other way is to sell something. So I think feed budgeting really is the way to deal with that, Sarah. It's just a long-winded way of getting to that point. Sorry, okay, so the next question is there a number of DSEs per labour unit which is ideal? This is from John Spilsbury. Does the benchmarking take into account family labour, say to a farm manager? Okay. Is there a number of DSEs per labour unit which is ideal? Look, I didn't touch on labour efficiency. Interestingly, some of those most profitable aren't necessarily the most labour efficient, but they do. The majority of them have reasonable levels of labour efficiency. But the short answer is yes, there's 20% of the database doing greater than 15,000 DSEs per labour unit, and there's over 5% doing greater than 20,000 DSEs per labour unit. Now, a labour unit is, 240 days of the year, and we know that you may work well longer than that. If you work 360 of those, then you're effectively 1 point something or other of a labour unit, 1.2 or 1.3 or whatever it is of a labour unit. So does the benchmark, the second part, so I think targeting those high levels of labour efficiency is important, but you have to understand that a lot of those high levels of labour efficiency are achieved through investment in improvements in infrastructure. Things like laneways and things like handling facilities go a long way to improving your level of labour efficiency. And water. Water infrastructure is a big one for costing your time. The second part of that question is, does the benchmarking take into account family labour, say to a farm manager? Look, we do. I think there's two separate issues here. One is labour efficiency, which I've talked about, which is number of labour units per DSE or number of DSEs per labour unit managed. The second part is the cost of labour, and what we do in the benchmarking is for a farm manager, we apply a cost per labour unit, and it's close to $70,000 for a farm manager, an owner manager, and then it's $45,000 for the next family labour unit. So you have no option. If you're an owner manager, that's what we'll apply to you. Now, it could be that other systems actually have higher costs or lower costs of that. If they don't have owner manager labour, that's fine. We put in the actual where you're not an owner manager. The next question is from Andrew McDougall, and he's got, are many of the top 20% crossbreeding to maximise kilograms of beef per hectare? Thanks for the question, Andrew. Look, not everyone in that top 20% is. So I guess what that tells me is crossbreeding is not necessarily the only pathway to being a top beef producer. But in short, I mean, crossbreeding, in my view, and in Holmes Sackett's analysis, generates, that hybrid vigour, at reasonably low cost. And so my view is that the hybrid vigor at reasonably low cost provides you with very good returns on investment. And so, and it's for that very reason that I've got this, what you can see in the picture in front of you is crossbred calves, because I guess it is one of those things that will contribute to higher levels of per hectare productivity. So thanks for the question. I'm not sure whether it was a Dorothy Dix, but knowing your system, I know you've gone that way, and my belief is that it's provided you with some of those benefits. Are there any other questions? I'm now. It's taken me a while, but I've got to the bottom of the questions pile. So if there's any other questions, feel free to type. Yep. So the next question is: does early weaning make any difference? Gosh, thanks, Hugh. Does it make any difference? Look. What I haven't done is looked at the number of months to weaning of that cohort, so I'm not sure necessarily, but my guess is, without digging into the data, is that the majority of those wean at between 6 and 7 months, not 8 and 9 months. But I could be wrong there. My guess is that given the majority calve between August, September, October, they're going to be weaning in February, March, April or thereabouts, and my guess is it's around 6 to 7 months. But do they do it earlier than that? Look, if they have to, if seasonal conditions dictate that they need to wean early, they'll do that. Basically, it's a tactic that they use in very dry times to wean earlier than that. So my guess is that it's really dictated by feed quality at that time. Pasture improvement investment. What % increase from native to improved do you need? So this is a question, pasture improvement investment, what percentage increase from native to improved do you need? I'm going to try and answer that in a different way, Murray. I'm going to answer that by saying that there are producers in that cohort that have very small areas of their total pasture base as perennial improved pastures, and there are producers in that cohort with quite a lot of pasture as perennial improved pastures. Now, so I don't think there is the percentage. I think the real question you're asking is really about return on investment. If your native pasture provides you with reasonable levels of productivity, will it pay you to put in an improved pasture? Well, the answer may be probably not. If your native pasture is providing you with low levels of productivity due to low levels of pasture quality and low levels of biomass, and you can get high levels of marginal pasture gain, then my view is yes, you may generate good returns on investment from pasture improvement. But look, those questions, which might be loaded, I'm not sure, but they're great questions and they're going to be answered in more detail on Thursday night. So tune in for that one because it's really all about that stuff. There's a question there, stocking rate. Look, I think that might be related to that preceding question, which is about what's the marginal increase in stocking rate you need. Look, I don't know. Then there's another one, winter wheats. That is winter wheats. I'm not sure what the reference to winter wheats is, but look, in that top 20% cohort,
unmuted.
There might be one or two that have winter wheats as part of their project program. So I don't see winter wheats as absolutely necessary for achieving high levels of profit per hectare. Do winter wheats change your potential for calving date? No, in my view. They might change how you load your system and so on. But look, they're not absolutely critical. I mean, we do have a very good producer in there who does have winter wheats, but the majority of them, from memory, I'm going from memory here, I'm not sure that they do have winter wheats necessarily in their system. Any other questions? I think we've still got 58 in the webinar. Okay, now we've got, yeah, thanks David. Yeah, this is the perennial question. How does cow size influence kilograms per hectare? I should have closed the webinar before you asked that question, David. Look, I might have to fend this one because there's two schools of thought here. There's a school of thought that, you know, smaller cows are better because they eat less, and therefore, and you know, the cow part of your equation consumes a fair bit of your feed. And the other school of thought is, well, actually bigger cows actually throw, genetically throw bigger, or genetically there is a relationship between those bigger cows and greater weight gain. So, so I'm not really answering your question, but to answer your question to some extent, look, if we looked at the cow weights of those top cohort, my guess is that they're in the range of 500 to 550 kilos. Now, I put the preface here that there is a range within that top 20% as well, but they're not looking for massive cows, is the first comment that I guess I'll make. Now, I know I haven't answered that all that well. I might have to follow up with that one. Hugh Webb's asked another one. What winter weight gains should be expected? Are they in the positive? Look, Hugh's alluding to, I think, the fact that I guess what we are promoting is running your productive or your trading cattle lean and mean through winter, and then putting the weight on in spring, and that way you can run more of them because they consume less through higher, through more pasture utilisation and higher stocking rates per hectare. I think my view is that you really have to have them achieving at least 300 grams per head per day, and probably north of that. But it's certainly not in the range of a kilo per head per day. Where you're getting a kilo, high weight gains per head through midwinter, there is a cost. And my view is the opportunity cost of getting those high weight gains in your weaner cattle through midwinter, the opportunity cost of that is running another weaner. So if you've got, for every one weaner that's consuming enough feed, or that's putting on a kilo, they're consuming double the amount of feed of another weaner that might be putting on, you know, around 400 grams. So, or 50% more. So you can run when they're putting on less. That's really the background to that, Hugh. So thanks for the question. Yes, they are in the positive. I don't think you want to target just, you know, nil weight gain through midwinter, because it won't be pretty, is my view. So yes, they're in the positive, and yes, I think you do have to have, you know, some level of weight gain to ensure that you hit the targets as well by that finish date. Now that does depend a little bit on when your finish date is as well. Okay, we've still got 53 online. I'm running out of questions, but still here, willing to answer them if they're posed to me. So Look, thanks again for your attendance, everyone. I just want to reiterate, please fill in that survey. It's the only way we've got of measuring MLA's investment in these things. So it only takes a minute. It is not extensive. Okay, so Gail Davis has got a question or a comment here. The MLA pasture to beef system and spreadsheet seems quite comprehensive. Yes, happy levy payer, what else should we do? I'm interpreting your question to some extent here, Gail. Firstly, it's great to see that you're a happy levy payer. But you're right, the MLA pasture to beef system and spreadsheet seems quite comprehensive. I don't know whether that's a comment or a comment on the level of detail in some of those spreadsheets. Look, a lot of those spreadsheets are quite detailed and they will take your time, but don't forget what's up for grabs. There's a lot in it, and I think what they do is also assist you to really understand your system. The next point that Gail's made is, what else should we do? Well, I think that's a great first start, is doing that, you know, when Gail's talking about the MLA pasture to beef system and spreadsheets, you're really talking about, there's a pasture growth tool, and then there's a tool that allows you to put in your livestock numbers and match it to that pasture growth to see whether there's shortages of feed or that you are on track. Now, it does require some level of competence doing that, but maybe a follow-up from this is how to use that tool, and I'd be happy to do that. In terms of what else should we do, look, I think that's really a strategic tool because that tool looks at what happens in a long-term situation. I think feed budgeting over different periods is really the key to driving tactical decisions. And by feed budgeting, there's some feed budgeting tools out there. I don't think all of them are great, but you know, anything's better than nothing. One of the constraints is really understanding your system well enough to know how to do the pasture assessments and how to get it into a format that provides you with a useful answer. So I hope I've answered your question there or added to the comment. Look, I think we're bang on or close to 8:30. If there's no more questions, I think what I'll do is wrap this up. But look, I really appreciate everyone's input and the fact that you're here listening. It does make it, whilst it's not that interactive for you, it's easier for me to run it this way. So look, thanks very much for your input. Please fill out the survey, and I'll look forward to seeing you on Thursday. Should you be there? Willing to take comments or questions, but really look forward to seeing you on Thursday. All right, I will speak soon, and we will see you at the next webinar.